Hi class, Dr. Jim here. In this lecture, we're actually going to look at the last set of organisms that we need to talk about in biology, and that would be the chordates. Now, most of you have probably heard the chordates as a different name or referred to as a different name, primarily known as the vertebrates, or those that have a backbone. Well, there are a couple organisms that are included in the chordate phylum, or the Chordata phylum, that don't actually have a bony backbone. And so we'll look at a couple of these animals, and so they're included. Really what the chordates mean is that they have some type of cord in their back. And so that's what chordate really means, is a cord, or what we call a notochord. And I'll talk a little bit more about those things. So in this lecture, what we're going to look at is all of the different characteristics that make up chordates, and then work our way through the different chordate groups. And again, you're probably familiar with most of these groups because we've seen them around, and some of you have these as pets and other things like that, and we'll go through and we'll work our way through the chordate phylum. All right, so let's begin with the lecture. So what are we going to look at today? Well, the first objective is what are the four characteristics of chordates. Now, I kind of alluded to this already talking about it, but chordates all have four things at some point in time in their development, meaning that they have a notochord at one point in time, they have their spinal cord, they have gill slits or gill pouches, and then finally a post-anal tail. And so those are the four main characteristics, and I'm going to show you, even as humans, we had these characteristics sometime during our development. You're going to be kind of shocked probably when you look at the development between a fish and a human that were really quite similar in our early stage of development. We all kind of start off as tadpoles and work our way into different things as time goes on. All right, so that's the first thing we're going to look at. Then we're going to look at what are the main characteristics of the vertebrates. So we're going to talk specifically about the ones that have backbone in that case. So what happens is the notochord actually becomes your vertebra and surrounds the dorsal nerve cord. And so what that does is it protects the nerve cord and also gives rise to the internal structure to keep us upright and allows us to walk on land. The last thing we're going to look at is what are the evolutionary developments that are developed to allow for the chordates to come out of the water as the fishes and turn into amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. And so we're going to look at all these different things and some of the evolutionary involvements that had to take place in order for this movement onto land to actually take place. Also, we're going to look at all the different classes, and I didn't mention that as an objective, and you're going to see we're going to work our way from the fishes to the amphibians to the reptiles to the birds, which are the class Aves, and then finally the mammals and what makes us mammals and why we're all called mammals. All right, so that's what we're going to look at today. So come join me on this journey. So I talked about the chordates. The chordates is the phylum. The phylum is known as Chordata, and so all the groups that are encompassed in this phylum Chordata have these four main characteristics. The first one being the notochord, and the notochord is the dorsal supporting rod. And so this is one of the first things that actually we see in development. Whether you're talking about fish or you're talking about humans, the notochord is the first thing really to develop along with the dorsal nerve cord. What you see is during development, we're going to talk about this in a few weeks, as you start getting folding on the neural plate, and that neural plate forms both the dorsal nerve cord and also the notochord. Eventually the notochord becomes our vertebrae. It surrounds and protects the dorsal nerve cord, but one of the first things that we actually see is the notochord. And again, like I said, notochord, if you look at this picture, forms underneath the nerve cord, and you can actually see that you start to see these cartilage that forms around it, and eventually in humans it becomes a vertebral structure, or the vertebral I can't think of it at the moment, the vertebral cavity or canal. That's what I was looking for. Okay, so that's what the notochord is. The second thing is the dorsal tubular nerve cord, and that runs in the back, or the dorsal part of the animal. And so most of the chordates are tetrapods, or four-legged if we talk about anything that on land. Humans are really different because we stand on two legs, but again, it's on our backside or the dorsal nerve. Now, if you remember to our invertebrate animals, when we talked about bugs and worms and that, where did they have their nerve cord? Most of the time it was running down their belly. And so their belly was that, and now in all the vertebrates and the chordates, all the nerves are actually running off the back or the dorsal side, and we're going to see why that is in a little bit. Okay, another thing that all chordates have is the pharyngeal pouches, and these pharyngeal pouches actually start off as gills and that stuff. And so in the aquatic animals, they turn into the gills and allow them to breathe underwater. But in mammals and birds and a number of other organisms that live on land, these pharyngeal pouches turn into a number of different things. And so we'll look at some of these different things. Again, we'll talk a little bit more when we get into the anatomy part, what they actually turn into. But just for the purposes of this lecture, what I want you to know is that the pharyngeal pouches turn into a lot of the parts of our jaw and our neck. Okay, so one is the mandible or the jaw that is the first arch. The second one is kind of our voice box, and then the third pouch actually turns into the thyroid and the thymus in that area. And so we can actually take a look and see what all those things do and what they actually look like once we get into more hardcore anatomy. But for now, I just want you to be aware that all chordates have pharyngeal pouches in the early stages of development, and then they turn into different things as time goes on. All right, and so the last thing is the postanal tail, and this extends beyond the anus. And you're probably saying, Dr. Jim, but we don't have tails. Well, you definitely have a tailbone, and I know a lot of you have probably fallen on that at some point in time, and it's hurt really bad for a number of days, and then finally it heals up. And we do have a remnant of a vestigial, is called, something we don't use anymore. It's called vestigial, a vestigial tail, and that's our little tailbone that we have. And really, really early on in development, as you can see here, and as I magnify this in, early in the embryonic stage, we actually have a tail, and then we lose that over time. We actually kind of reabsorb that tail, and eventually by the time we get to 12 weeks old, we lost our tail. But we do have a tail at some point in time. Okay, so I just wanted you to be aware that some of you had, or all of us have had a tail at one point in time or other. So just to let you know that, okay? And so all chordates have had a postanal tail that extends beyond the anus, and that's why we call it the postanal tail. All right, so those are the four characteristics that all chordates have. So make sure you remember that, because we asked that a number of times on the test. So make sure you look at those things and why we have those things. Okay, so I've talked about development before, and one of the interesting things is you can look at development of a fish all the way up to humans, and in the early stage of development we all look very similar, and you can see this here in this picture, which kind of gives you a really cool idea. If you look at the fish, reptiles, birds, and humans, we all kind of look the same very early on, and that's really a big evidence of evolution right there, is how we early stage of development we all look the same. And if you look at the fish, here's a fish closer to delivery compared to a human, you can see that again we have a lot of the same characteristics very early on, and then again as time goes on and we develop into the adult, we definitely lose a lot of those characteristics and we look a lot different. So we don't look like fish anymore, but we actually look like humans in that. And so that's, again, the point to make is that early in development, we all look the same. And that really gives a lot of evidence to evolution. And, and even those people that believe in creationism can say, well, God had the master plan and it was easy to make everything the same way. And I agree with that. But again, this really gives an idea of the evidence of evolution. Okay? And so that's what we're looking at. All right, so like I said, not all chordates are vertebrates, okay? So not all of them have a true vertebrate skeleton on the back. And there's actually a couple animals that you may be familiar with or you may have never heard of before that actually are out there that actually show the characteristics of a chordate as an adult, okay? And so we call these non-vertebrate chordates, and the notochord persists and is never replaced by the vertebral column, okay? And the two groups that are included in that are the lancets, and again, you're going to see this in the lab with our models, and so we expect you to know some of the parts of the lancet. So you're going to see the notochord, the dorsal nerve cord, the pharyngeal pouches or slits, and then finally the postanal tail. And so this is the one animal that displays all those characteristics even as an adult. The other one that you probably are like, this doesn't look anything like a chordate or what I would expect to be a chordate, and that's true. Where we see these sea squirts actually look like chordates is when they're early as a nymph, and so, or as a larval stage. They actually have the notochord, they have the tail, they have the dorsal nerve cord, and they have the gill slits. So they have all four parts of a chordate. But if you look at them as an adult, they look kind of like a big hollow balloon, and they actually kind of look like a heart. And so if you look at these online, if you ever take the chance and just type in sea squirt online, you're going to see a lot of different pictures of the sea squirts, and they kind of look like a heart. And what they do as an adult, they actually filter feed. They bring the water in through their openings, and then eat the food that comes in and then release the rest out as waste. And they also breathe this way because they have the gill slits on the inside. They bring in the oxygen with the water and then they release it out. And so these are the very early chordates. They don't look like the normal chordates and they never developed the vertebra, so they're not vertebrates, but they are still considered in the phylum Chordata because they have all four characteristics at some point in time in their lives. Okay? All right, so now we get into the vertebrates. The rest of the animals we're going to talk about today all have some type of vertebrate backbone. Okay, and so they're either cartilage like the sharks, or they have the real bones like humans or birds or reptiles. And so we'll look at all these different animals today. And so what are some of the characteristics of vertebrates? Well, the first one is the vertebral column. And again, you look from sharks all the way up to humans, we all have some type of vertebral column that protects that dorsal nerve cord. And one of the reasons why they think that happened, why the notochord came in, was actually to protect the animals, especially on land and in the water, from predators coming in and trying to bite them on their back. And so it's a way to protect their dorsal nerve cord, because that was really important to protect that cord so that you don't become paralyzed. Okay, and so that's one of the reasons why we think evolutionarily we developed this vertebral column to protect the nerve cord. Okay, the other thing that it does is gives us evidence of segmentation. We talked about this with the earthworms. You remember all the segments, and luckily we didn't have to call the segments. But you too are segmented, and if you look at your vertebral column, each one of those represents a different segment of your body plan. And so that's why we have those different segments. And so we are segmented animals as well. And really the evidence for that is the vertebral column. All right. The next thing is the skull. So most or all the vertebrates have cephalization, meaning they have a true head. Most of them have a mouth to open and eat from, and most of them have eyes that are pointed forward or to the sides, and then they have an enclosed skull to protect the brain. What we're going to see as we move up the evolutionary chain from sharks all the way up to humans is that the brain actually gets bigger, bigger, and bigger, and bigger. And we're going to talk more about that when we get into the nervous system. But what I want you to be aware of is all the vertebrates have very well developed brains, okay? And in the sense of being able to maybe not all think, but actually to rationalize and do certain things and keep them moving in that. And so you're going to see more and more development of this ganglia into a brain and really good cephalization, meaning that you have a head. Okay? So that's the other thing that you see. The last thing is the endoskeleton on the inside. That endoskeleton protects the body, and so that protection. So in the bugs and the insects, you saw the exoskeleton, which was on the outside. In all vertebrates, we have the endoskeleton. This is living tissue. It's bone. We talked about tissues, or we're going to talk about tissues, and that's one of the connective tissues is bone. It also protects all our organs. So where our most vital organs, our brain and our heart and our lungs, and again, those are protected by very hard bones. Their sternum is very tough to break through, and so they have to take a bone saw if they have to want to get at your heart to do any heart surgery. And again, your brain is protected by this skull. And again, very hard bones for protection, protecting the most vital organs, okay? Again, it gives a place for attachment for muscles so you can move, and then the paired appendages are also characteristic. So again, we have 2 legs and 2 arms, but most animals have 4 legs, and so they have paired appendages to allow them to move around. And you can see this down here, all the different paired appendages, and you can actually look at similar bones in different animals, and you're going to look at that as well when we get into the skeletal system in that. All right, so those are some of the characteristics. The other thing is internal organs, and again, we have lots and lots of internal organs, a complete digestive tract. Most of us have a complete circulatory system, whether we have two ventricles or 1, or how many chambers of the heart we have. That varies depending on how far away or how developed your systems are. But I want you to know that we get more and more development as we go on, especially with these internal organs. You can see a closed circulatory system. Respiratory system is based on either gills or lungs. We have lungs because we live on land, but any aquatic animal is going to have gills to allow them to survive. All right, and when we look at the frog this week, when you dissect the frog, you're going to see all these things, a very complete digestive system. And the interesting thing is a lot of the stuff that you see in the frog would be the exact same place that you would see in the human, and that's a big situation. And so if you dissect the frog, you're really looking at very similar organs that we see in reptiles, you see in birds and you see in mammals. And so it really doesn't change. And so the vertebrates really contain a lot of the same organs that we see as we go on. So, all right, and we'll talk more about that when we get into the organs and things like that as well. But dissecting the frog, that's why I throw that picture on there. It might be gross, but you guys are going to do it this week, so have fun with that. All right, and then the last thing is the kidneys. And again, this is a big thing because, again, we live in a lot of different environments. Especially if you live on land, you need to be able to conserve your water because we're losing water all the time because we're not bathed in water. And so one of the big things is having a system in order to keep the water and get rid of the waste. And that's really important for function of the kidneys. And again, it regulates the balance of water. All right, and we'll, again, talk more about that when we get into the kidneys and the excretory system, and then also the reproductive system as well. And so we'll talk all about that stuff in a few weeks coming up. All right, so lots of important things that all vertebrates have. So let's start on the animals. So again, vertebrate evolution, one of the big things that happened during vertebrate evolution was development of jaws. And you remember I talked about having those pharyngeal pouches. Well, the first pharyngeal pouch actually developed very early on in most animals as the mandible. And so that first pouch that we have is our mandible and allows us to eat things. And so we'll talk more about eating and capturing prey and things like that later on. But again, that's an important thing that we see with the development or evolution of the vertebrates is getting the jaws. Okay, and we call these gnathosomes because that means having a mouth. All right, and so we'll look at these things. And so the first group we're going to look at is the fishes. And so there are about 28,000 species. It's the largest group of vertebrates out there, and they are the oldest group of vertebrates that are out there. They're all aquatic, gill-breathing vertebrates. They all have some form of backbone, whether it be in a cartilage backbone or being a bony backbone. And they usually have fins and scales of some sort covering their skins. And this, again, ranges from the fishes that you see. So Dory from the wonderful movie, I can't think of the movie right now offhand, but you guys probably know it better than me. And then, of course, the sharks from Shark Week, and then the stingrays and things like this. And so these are all part of the different fishes in that Finding Nemo. That was it, Dory from Finding Nemo. Okay, and so those are the different fishes. Now, the jawless fishes are known as the agnathians, and that meaning they basically don't have a jaw, or don't have a mouth, or don't have a jaw. That's why they have the A in front. And this includes the lampreys and hagfishes. And probably if you've lived on the Great Lakes, you may have heard about lampreys before. This was an introduced species by accident because they were on the boats that came down the St. Lawrence River, and they were brought into the Great Lakes and actually have caused a lot of detrimental problems with the Great Lakes earlier on. So now we're all worried about the flying fishes and those guys that jump out of the boats. Well, one of the original species we worried about were these lampreys. And again, these guys are typically found in the ocean or found closer to the ocean, and they've made their way due to traveling boats and that stuff into the Great Lakes and actually eaten up a lot of the fish that were found in the Great Lakes. Now, one of the things you see with these guys is that they always attach to the side and they kind of suck off. So they're kind of like a parasite in that sense, is that they come in and with their teeth and they kind of grind onto a fish. And so you see these a lot of times being very predatory and parasitic onto fish. So you'll see some fish swimming by and it looks like they have these giant worms hanging off. And what those really are the lamprey that are coming off there. And so these are a special type of fish because they don't really have jaws. These are the first fish. And these are called the agnathians because they're missing their mouth, okay? Missing their jaw. So now we'll look at the rest of the groups of fishes, the fishes with jaws. And again, the characteristics of these things is, one, they have ectothermy, meaning they're cold-blooded, so the temperature of the water regulates the temperature of their body. They have gills for breathing. They're either cartilaginous or bony skeleton, and then they have scales. And so you can compare the two between the cartilaginous fish, that's hard to say, or the sharks, and then the wonderful bony fish, which are the fish that you typically eat and things like that. And so those are the two types of fish that we're going to look at here in just a second. So the first group is the Chondrichthyes, okay? So it's a hard name to say, but what it means is cartilage fish. So chondrichthyes, or right here, chondrichthyes is the cartilage, and ichthyes, it means fish, so cartilage fish. So that's where the name comes from. Hard to say, but easy to remember. Cartilage fish, okay? And these are your sharks and your rays. And basically they have a skeleton of cartilage instead of bones. This includes the sharks, rays, and skates. They lack a gill cover, so you see their gills opening up all the time. And so one of the things when you watch sharks swim by and that stuff, you always see their gills opening up because they have to constantly move to get water over their gills. Okay, they're filter feeders and predators. Most of the sharks are harmless, but the ones that get the bad rep are the ones that eat people and things like that. And they're not actively going out looking for people. So the misconception is that we have all these great white sharks going out there and eating people. That's not really the case. There's not a lot of shark attacks, but when they do attack, that gets notoriety and people get scared and want to kill all the sharks and get rid of them. But they're actually very important for the ecosystem. And I want to point out, most sharks are very harmless. They don't care about humans. They want to stay away from humans. And most are relatively safe. Okay? That doesn't mean if there's a shark outbreak, I want you to go out there and spear all the sharks. But again, it's one of those things that, you know, a few of the sharks give the sharks a bad rep and that stuff. The other thing that are included in these groups are the rays and skates, and they have long pectoral fins, which are on the sides, and they kind of develop into these sails or wings that you see. And a lot of you have probably taken your kids to the zoo, or maybe you've gone to the zoo yourself, and you do the whole petting of the sharks and rays and that stuff, and they're really cool animals. And most of them are docile. Again, they get a bad rep because everyone heard of Steve Irwin, the crocodile hunter, and again, he got stung, and it was a defense mechanism by the ray. He probably picked it up and said, look what happens, you know, type of thing. And it hit him right in the chest, right in the sweet spot. And so it was one of those things that, you know, it was probably 1 in 1,000 shot that killed him, but it was one of those things. And so now they probably have a bad rep too because they killed the crocodile hunter. You know, you think of all the things that he dealt with, and this is the thing that he went down by. But again, they're very magnificent, very beautiful animals to watch them swim in that stuff. And if you do get a chance to go to the zoo, definitely take an opportunity to look at those things and try and pet them. They're very, you know, they're very calm, and it's very calming type of creatures to look at. All right, so these are the cartilage fish. All right, the next group is the Osteichthyes, and so the Osteichthyes are the bony fish. Oste meaning bone, and ichthyes meaning fish. Okay, and so these are the bony fish, and they have a skeleton of bone. So the cartilage is lost, and now it's replaced with bone. And again, most of these are called ray fin fishes because they have bones that come out of their fins. And most of you fishermen out there probably know this. So when you catch a fish, they bring up their fins, and they're really spikes. And so again, it's a defense mechanism to keep them. And again, when you grab a fish, you want to push those down so that you don't get poked by those. And again, they can poke you and make you bleed and things like that. So again, these are the ray fin fishes, and that's part of their way that they move these things around. Okay. The other thing that most of these fishes have is a swim bladder, and that's a big gas-filled space that allows them to give them buoyancy to move them up and down. And it kind of moves like a submarine does, or the same concept. And again, when you want to bring it down, you put more weight into it, so you fill it up more with water and less air, and you bring yourself down. When you want to get closer to the surface, you fill it up with air, so you rise up. Same concept as a submarine works. And so what we call, you know, the buoyancy, that's how the fish control their buoyancy, is by using this swim bladder. And it's, again, controlling how much water and air that's in there, allowing them to go to different levels of the water. Okay? All right. And again, well-developed brain and nervous system. Again, you see these fish. The big difference, not only with the sharks, is the gill covering. On the bony fish, you see the bony skeleton, the gill covers, things like this, things that you wouldn't see in the sharks. Okay, and again, well-developed eyes and brain. Same thing with the sharks. Well-developed eyes and brain. They can sense things from miles away. So again, very important. All right. Now another group of fish that I just wanted to bring up, because this kind of ties into the movement onto land, is the lobe fin fishes. And they're slightly different because they start developing their lobes or their fins into more like appendages that help them move, okay? And not the sense that, again, you use your fins to move through the water and maybe swim, but these are actually turning more into more like paddles and actually ways to actually moving things. And they're actually the first evidence of appendages that these animals have to work onto the land. And so again, a lot of these lobe-finned fishes possess fleshy fins supported by bones rather than the ray fins, okay? And again, we think that they gave rise to the modern lobe-finned fishes and amphibians. And the example that we have nowadays are the lungfishes and the coelacanths. And these are modern day lobe-finned fishes that actually look like they have little lobes. And where do we see these things? They actually get out of the water and they can crawl on the land. And so these lungfishes, because they actually can forget about using their lungs, they actually, or gills, and actually have a small rudimentary pair of lungs that allow them to survive on the land. And so they think that evolutionarily these fish were the first ones to come out of the water, the first vertebrates to come out of the water and lead to the amphibians and reptiles, birds, and mammals at this point. And so that's where we get this evolutionary development. So the next group we're going to talk about, or I guess I should talk about the evolutionary movement onto land, is the lungs and the bony skeleton. And so that movement to land. So again, the loss of the lung, or loss of gills, and replaced with the lungs. And if you look at the amphibians and how they go through metamorphosis, so the interesting thing with that is that the frogs start as tadpoles and they have gills. But as they get older and older and go closer to adult, they actually go through the process of a metamorphosis, and so they lose their gills and actually develop lungs. And this is kind of where we get this evidence of evolution, coming out of the water and going onto the land. And so that actually happens during the metamorphosis. So they start as tadpoles in the water and come out as live frogs on the land, which actually have lungs and everything else. Most of them have 4 limbs that are replace the fins, and so their fins now become legs, and you can see here are the fins, and now they become lobes that allow them to walk onto the land. And again, the bones get stronger and stronger to support the weight, because in water, and many of you know this, you become very light and you can float and things like this. And so even when you're really heavy, you still float. When you come onto land, it's much more weight and it's much more taxing on the skeleton. And so the bones get stronger, get more developed, and again allows you to support that weight onto the land, because that's a big issue there. And so that's the other thing. The other big evolutionary development coming onto the land was that we produced this amniotic egg. And so again, reproduction needs water. So sperm need to swim and eggs need to float around. And so in order to do that, you have to come up with a way to mimic the water. Okay, so a lot of the vertebrates have developed internal fertilization, one to keep everything moist, okay, their favorite word out there, to keep everything wet and moist. Okay, the other thing is that we develop these eggs that allow them to be laid and protected. Now in mammals, most of the time it's internal development, so our eggs are actually in the inside. But in reptiles, amphibians, and birds, they all lay eggs. And so those eggs have to be protected, and they also provide an area for that egg to develop in a very wet environment. Again, you need water in order to reproduce, and so it allows for this reproduction on land. Okay, and so again, you can see where the frogs require water to be laid, and so the frogs still go to the water to lay their eggs. In reptiles, birds, and mammals, we've all developed ways in order to lay eggs or do internal fertilization and development like in the mammals. And so if you look at all these things, it's either a soft egg, which is in the reptiles, a hard shell egg like in the birds, or internal development where the egg becomes a placenta and all this other stuff and it's attached, so you don't have an external egg, and that's in the mammals. And so we'll look at more of these examples as well as we go on throughout the rest of this chapter. Okay, so that's the amniotic egg, or the protection from the amniotes. All right, so now we get into the amphibians, and the amphibians are important because they're the first vertebrates onto the land, and these include the frogs and salamanders, and these contain libs. These are the first tetrapods, the 4 legs getting onto the land, and I give these great examples of the frog and salamander here. Again, now they've also lost their scales. They're more smooth and non-scaly. And this is one of the animals that you know when you have good soil and good wetlands. If you see these things around, that means things are good and viable. When you don't, or you lose this population, that means you have lots of pollution around. And so that's one of the first things they look for, is what are the frog populations doing. The other thing that these things have are lungs, again, usually present in adults. So again, frogs metamorph from the tadpoles that have gills into the lungs that are in the frogs. They have a double loop circulatory system. In amphibians, they have a 3-chambered heart. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. They have the sense organs that are fine-tuned to life on land, so they can watch out for predators and also look for prey. They still have ectothermy, which means they're cold-blooded, so they're responsible for either warming themselves up or cooling themselves down by going into the sun or into the shade. And then they have aquatic reproduction. So again, they have to return to the water to lay eggs, and that's important. So what I wanted to bring up here was, again, the idea of the circulatory system. So in fish, they typically have a two-chambered heart. They have one ventricle and one atrium. So the blood comes into the atrium, goes to the ventricle, gets pumped to the gills, and then the blood goes throughout. And so you really need to have a very efficient heart to pump that through, because you're pumping it first to the gills and then all the way throughout the body and then back to the heart again. And so again, it leads you to making sure you have a very efficient heart, because you only have one atrium, one ventricle. And amphibians, they've actually developed two atria and one ventricle. The only problem with this is that it's still a little inefficient, because what you see here is you get a mixing of the blood. So not only do you have non-oxygenated blood, but you also have oxygenated blood coming into the ventricle. And so again, you have this mixing, and so it's not nearly as efficient as if you had four chambers. And so we only really see this in amphibians and most of the reptiles. Once we get above the reptiles, we start to see the four-chambered heart. So the crocodilians, so the alligators and crocodiles have a four-chambered heart. The dinosaurs had a four-chambered heart. The birds and the mammals all had four chambers. And so again, you see this in the evolutionary. It becomes more and more efficient when you're not pumping non-oxygenated blood throughout the rest of the body. You're only pumping it to the lungs, so it gets oxygenated, and then you're pumping all that throughout the body. You're much more efficient than if you're pumping both oxygenated and non-oxygenated blood throughout the body. Okay, and so that's one of the reasons for that development of the four chambers, and we're going to get more into that when we get into circulation. All right, so the next group is the reptiles. So let's take a look at the reptiles. This includes the turtle and the tortoises. Again, ribs and thoracic vertebrae fused to the heavy shell. Lack teeth but have a sharp beak. Okay, the lizards, most have four-clawed feet. These are carnivorous. You have the snakes that have lost their limbs, but they're, as an adaptation to burrow, and again, they're carnivorous. They eat meat. The tuturas, which are some of these lizards that some of your kids may want to own or have, and you've actually seen these. And again, they have what is a third eye, and we'll talk more about this as well. It helps regulate the daylight circadian rhythms, and that it's the pineal gland that we have. Again, we don't have that third eye, but again, a lot of scientists do call it a third eye, and we'll talk more about this later on. And then finally, the crocodiles, or the crocodilians, and again, long, powerful jaws, a muscular tail that's used as a weapon and a paddle. And so these are all these different groups are part of the reptiles. And again, reptiles have a lot of different things. And again, we're going to talk about a little bit about what makes up a reptile, but you can see a lot of diversity going on in this class of reptiles. Okay, so where do the dinosaurs fit into all this? I know a lot of you have probably seen these in museums or watched cartoons or other things, or some movies about these, or maybe Jurassic Park. And a lot of people associate dinosaurs with lizards, and that makes a lot of sense because we're reptiles, because that's kind of what they look like. And so actually the name dinosaur means terrible lizard. And so, however, that name is actually wrong in that they're not really reptiles, because they're kind of in between the reptiles and the birds. And so they're kind of that middle step. Crocodiles, or crocodilians, dinosaurs, and birds all shared a common ancestor. And if you look at their development, you can see here, this goes to the crocs and the relatives, and then you see the development of the dinosaurs, and then finally at the very end you see the birds. And so birds actually evolved from the dinosaurs as well. And so the dinosaurs and birds both develop endothermy, which means warm-bloodedness. And so that's one of the reasons why we know birds and dinosaurs are actually closely related, because you actually see this endothermy, which means warm-blooded, that they could actually regulate their temperature from the inside and not having to sit out in the sun like a crocodile does and then go into the cool area and cool yourself off. And that's what that really means. Okay. And the other thing is birds developed right near the same time, or during the Jurassic period, about 180 million years ago. And they again developed off an offshoot of the dinosaurs. And so some of the dinosaurs that we've seen, like the pterodactyls and things like that, actually kind of look like birds. And again, we associate that with that passage or evolution into the birds. And so some of the relatives of the dinosaurs are still around with us, and so it's hard to believe that those cardinals and robins are ancient ancestors of the dinosaurs as well, or evolved from the dinosaurs as well. So I just wanted to put that in there just to kind of let you know. I'm not going to ask anything about the dinosaurs, but I think a lot of you have questions of how does it all fit together. All right, so I talked a lot about the birds. We're going to talk about the birds now. And the characteristics of the birds include feathers, having that modified skeleton, again, which allows them to fly. So a lot of them have air-filled spaces within the bones to make them light so that they can get off the ground. That's one of the problems with mammals. We don't have those air-filled bones, so we can't get off the ground very well. We're too heavy. Other thing that you see is that hard bone in the center of the sternum, or the sternum actually becomes a keel, allows them to fly, so you actually see that development. And you can see this sometimes when you're eating chicken. So the next time you get a boned-in chicken and you look at that, you look at the breastbone, you can actually see that it comes out, and it's kind of pointed out where the breast comes in, and that is actually to help them to fly and help them steer themselves one way or the other. Again, modified respiration. Lungs are contained air sacs that help them fly and move up and down, and so they have kind of like the swim bladder that allows them to give some buoyancy. They have endothermy, which means that they're regulated inside rather than outside, so they don't have to sit in the sun to get warm or go in the shade to get cool. And then again, a well-developed sense organs, and again, very acute vision. Hawks that you see flying around now, the peregrine falcons that are flying in the city, can see, you know, very up close. They can see that mouse running around, and they can swoop in and grab that mouse before the mouse even has a chance to get away. And so again, very acute vision, very developed senses, again, very good nervous system in that sense, and that's what we're seeing. As we move along through the evolutionary chain, we're getting more and more development of senses and more development of predation in these animals. Okay, so this is the birds, or the class Aves, it's called. Okay. One of the interesting things about the birds is that most of them can fly. Obviously, there are a few that cannot, and that includes the emus, which are the big ostriches, penguins, kiwis, and that number of large birds that can't get off the ground because they're much too big to get off the ground, and it'd be very scary if they got off the ground. And again, how we classify birds is a lot of times by their beak type. And again, you can look at their different beaks and what they do. And so you can see an eagle here has a sharp beak that allows them to tear into muscles and things like that. So good at predation. Woodpeckers have a long, slender beak that allows them to get into the wood and suck out the insects in the trees. Again, the beaks here on the parrots allow them to break into seeds and nuts and get in and be able to grasp and use their beaks to do that. And then the cardinals are very inept at busting up the little bird seed and sunflower seeds and things like that. So they're sharp little beaks. Again, lots of different evolutionary incidences, and again, how they eat and what they eat depends on what their beaks look like as well. Okay. Again, a little information about the birds. All right, now the last group is the mammals. We finally made it to the mammals. You're going, Dr. Jim, is there any more? This is it, I promise. This is the last group we're going to look at. It's the class Mammalia, and that's what we are. Okay, we made it to the end. And so what are the characteristics? Well, we have hair, and so here are your fuzzy little dogs and cats, and again, we also have hair. That's a characteristic. The second thing is the mammary glands, and again, breastfeeding, and again, all mammals have the characteristic mammary glands, provide milk to their young, and so that's why they're classified as mammals. That's what mammals mean, is mammary. And again, I like this little one. The baby's like breastfeeding, it rocks, and so I throw that in as a little humor for you guys. Again, skeleton, the mammalian skull accommodates larger brain relative to body size. And then again, we have differentiated teeth depending on what we eat. And you can look at the different mammals. And again, I won't take you through all these different things, but you can see we have different teeth that allow us to do everything. And so we're actually omnivorous. We can either eat plants or animals. And so we eat both plants and animals. And that's because we have both types of teeth. We have the incisors, which help us gnaw and tear and things like this. We have our canines, which help us, again, tear and dive into muscle. We have our molars, which help us grind and break things down, and again, helps us break down both meat and plants. If you're a herbivore, meaning you only eat vegetation, you're only going to have your molars. You're not going to have a lot of things that help tear and grind or help tear and things. If you're only a carnivore, you're only going to have the incisors and things like that to help tear and rip things apart. But if you do both, you're going to have all sets of teeth. And so that's one of those things that you look at when we talk about the different various types of mammalian teeth and those things. All right. Some other things is the internal organs. Again, very efficient respiration, circulation. We're going to talk about this more when we get into the humans. the double loop circulatory system with a 4-chambered heart. Kidneys have adapted to conserve water, and so you've seen this by the different color of pee that you make, and again, we'll talk more about that in the excretory system. And then highly developed nervous system, again, with all the senses, our highly developed brains, conscious thought, things like this, and all these different things. And again, make the mammals probably the top of the order, the king of the classes, and that stuff, because again, with all the different developments that they've gone through throughout the time. The other big thing in most mammals is the internal development. We've lost the ability to lay eggs because we have all internal development. And again, there's some slight differences, and I'll point those out here in just a minute. But most of the mammals that we look at today, or most of the mammals we think of that are mammals, have internal development and what they do and how they develop and that stuff. And so that's important as well. Okay, so the 3 groups of mammals that I really want you to kind of think about are basically the duck-billed platypuses, which are called the monotremes, and these are the ones that kind of look kind of weird. And are you sure they actually fit into the mammals? Well, they do, because they have fur, they provide milk. However, they have characteristics of birds because they have the duck bill, and they also lay eggs. And so they have a lot of different things that rely to here. And here's our duck-billed platypus, and you see these in the wild in Australia. Okay. The other group are marsupials. These are ones that actually don't have internal development. They have early internal development. Then the little fetus comes out and climbs into the pouch and then develops inside the pouch. And so that's the pouched animals. So that includes kangaroos, koalas, and the ones that we have here in this on this side of the hemisphere are the opossums. And so the opossums that are out there are marsupials, and they are out there. And so here you go. Here's our opossum, and they actually use a pouch to develop their young. And so they're a little bit different than the typical mammal. Now, the last set of mammals are all the placental mammals, meaning that they have placentas that allow for early development. And this includes whales, elephants, gorillas, you name it, the mammals that are out there. As long as they have hair, they have mammary glands, and they have some type of internal development, they are considered placental mammals. And so that's the group that we look at. And so we've looked at a lot of different mammals today, and I'm not going to spend too much time in all these things and a lot of different animals. But again, this is the important characteristic, and we are a placental mammal. Again, we're included in this. We have hair, we have mammary glands, and again, we have internal development with that, with the placenta. All right, so we've finally come to the end. I'm sorry for making this such a long lecture, but it's very important. This is the last group that we're going to look at. It's hard to put these all together. I could have broken it down to 2 videos, but then you'd be mad at me for that too, so I might as well just throw it all at you at once. So remember, what are the 4 characteristics of every chordate? Well, that is the notochord, which it turns into the vertebral column around us, surrounds that dorsal hollow nerve cord, which is the second thing. All vertebrates, or all chordates, have that dorsal nerve cord on the back. We all have pharyngeal gills, okay? At one point in time in our development, we are very early on. If you remember back to that one picture, fish all the way to humans look very similar early on. And then we start to lose those things. Our gill slits become our jaw, our neck, our vocal cords, and then finally our thymus or thyroid and that stuff, and so on, all those different gills. The last thing is the postanal tail. Now in humans, we've lost our tail during the time, but early on in development, we all have that postanal tail. And then again, we still have some remnants of it, and that's our tailbone. And again, you land on it, that thing hurts. And so you know it's there. Again, the other characteristics of vertebrates include the vertebral column, the cephalization, the forming of the head, well-developed brain and senses, and then the internal skeleton on the inside allows us to survive, not only protect our organs, muscle attachment, things like this, but also to move onto land and be able to colonize land. Again, major evolution advancements onto land include the lungs, obviously very important to breathe oxygen, and then the amniotic egg. So that was one of the big things getting away from the water, was how do we reproduce? Well, we have internal reproduction to keep things wet and moist on the inside, and then also the internal egg, or the amniotic egg, so that either you lay eggs or you have internal development, and so that's very important as well. And then the last thing I just want to point out is we ask these things on the test, and it's pretty easy to remember, and that's knowing some basic characteristics of all the classes of vertebrates. And so I can take you through real quickly of all the different things. And we think of the cartilage fish, meaning that they have cartilage as their backbones. That's the sharks and rays and snakes, or sharks and rays, not the snakes. You have the bony fishes, which are the fish that have a bony skeleton. The characteristics for amphibians, again, they are the frogs and salamanders, and again, you're going to know some of the basic characteristics. They have the non-scaly skin, ectothermy, they go to the water to lay their eggs. You look at the reptiles, they have the scales again, they have ectothermy, things like that. Important things about the aves or birds are going to be the feathers, endothermy, having the ability to regulate their temperature by internal mechanisms, again using parts of their brain, and then the mammals, the mammary glands, the hair, and then internal development as well. And those are just some of the general characteristics. And again, you're going to remember those just by looking at these things and go, oh yeah, I know what a frog looks like. Oh yeah, I know what a snake or a reptile looks like. And again, don't worry yourself too much about those things. We just want you to make sure that you have a good representation and know, again, an animal from each one. So make sure you know an animal for each one. And I'm sure you guys already probably know that without me giving you more and more talk. So we've come to the end of this finally. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask me. Stop me in the lab. I'm happy to ask any questions or answer any questions that you have and that stuff. I thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.